for this service. We appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. So summer is almost upon us. You know, we have some nice weather going on outside, and, you know, some outdoor activities are happening. And with it being 2024, what that also means is coming up in Paris, we're going to have the Summer Olympics coming up. Any big Olympic fans out there? A few of you out there. Not a whole lot, but I've never been a big fan of the Olympics. Not a big fan, but I've never been a big watcher of the Olympics. I don't have anything against the Olympics. They're great. I've just never been a big watcher of the Olympics. There is one sport I do enjoy watching, but it's the Winter Olympics, and that's curling. I love watching some curling. It's the only sport that I feel like I could do that. I could roll a rock, or not slide a rock down the ice, and I can use a broom. You know, I could do it. If just a little bit of training. But a big Summer Olympics are coming up. Big Summer Olympic sport, also a sport that I've never really watched all that much, but is a pretty big sport in the Summer Olympics. It's the track and field sports, right? And the U.S. has been a pretty dominant force in track and field sports over the years. Again, didn't know that until this week. I'm surprised. But just kind of reading a little bit about it, the medal count, all-time medal count for track and field sports in the Olympics, the U.S. has won 802 medals in track and field sports, which that sounds like a really high number, but it sounds even higher when you realize that that's more than double the amount of total medals than the next highest nation has in track and field sports. So the U.S. has been a pretty dominant force in track and field sports in the Summer Olympics. Despite this dominance, though, and often high expectations every 4 years that we have for these teams, it doesn't always pan out the way we hope and the way we think it would. One example of this is the USA in the 2008 Summer Olympics in the 4x200 relay. And I will show you a quick video.
African Kumbane who's running, but the Americans are out to a good lead. Baton. They come to the last leg, and Tyson Gay of the United States is away, and the Americans have missed it. They've completely missed it, and the Japanese will come home in this heat in second. But first, I think it's Trinidad and Tobago. Tyson Gay out off his mark a little too early.
Team USA, what a tragedy. Here it comes.
Let's see what happened. Gay went out too early. Yeah, exactly. His teammate was screaming out. No, they just dropped it. Perhaps a bit of both.
Well, I think Gay was okay, but look, Patton's got it in his right, and he's going over to the...
They dropped the baton. On the final leg of the 4x200 relay race, they were in the lead, running a good race up until that point, and they dropped the baton heading into the final leg of the race. And here's the thing, both men's and women's teams did this. They both dropped the baton in the qualifying rounds so that neither men's and women's teams expected to go in and dominate and win the gold in this sport. They both dropped the batons in qualifying rounds and didn't even make it to the final round of the Olympics and were completely out of the medals. Ran a great race, dropped the baton. Passing the baton is a crucial moment in the race. It's a significant transition where the main responsibility for the running of a race is moved from one person to another, and it marks the end of one leg of the race and the beginning of another leg. And it's a pivotal time because, as we just saw, a phenomenal race can be completely overshadowed by a botched handoff. And the importance of this successfully passing the baton, it's true in a relay race. It's also true of those of us that are part of a community of people who have a desire to follow Jesus. As I mentioned, we've had our students up here this morning leading us in worship and using their gifts to serve throughout this service. Later on in our service, we're going to be celebrating 4 of our students who will be graduating from high school and moving on to the next chapter of their lives. So it seemed like an appropriate time to pause and ask ourselves the question of how are we doing with this? How are we doing as individuals, and how are we doing as a community at passing the baton of faith to those who are going to be running the next legs of this race? And answering that question is going to be the big focus of our time here together this morning as we understand the truth that continuing the relay race of faith requires that we pass the baton well. Paul wrote about the importance of this truth in his second letter to Timothy. Timothy, who was a young pastor at the church at Ephesus, he'd been discipled by Paul, and Paul wrote him letters to instruct him and to guide him and to encourage him as he led this church. And in his second letter to Timothy, we read these words in chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Paul writes, "You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." Now, if you read this passage and you look at it closely, you'll note that Paul references or implies 4 spiritual baton passes in this passage, in this brief 2 verses. First, the one is a little bit more implied. It's the baton pass from Jesus to Paul. Paul isn't inventing these things that he is speaking and sharing with Timothy. Paul didn't come up with these things on his own. They were passed on to him by Jesus himself. And then there is Paul passing these things on to Timothy, where he says, "The things you heard me say." See, Timothy, all the things I taught to you, all the things I spoke to you, all the ways that I prepared and equipped you, he tells Timothy, communicate these truths to the third baton pass. He says, to reliable people. Find reliable people that you can pass on what I passed on to you. And then we have the fourth, that the expectation is then that those reliable people would then teach others. And guess what? If you keep following that down, if you keep going with that, that baton passes on and on from generation to generation. And do you know where we eventually end up? Here, to you and me. We are here this morning because someone was a reliable person that taught us the things that were passed on to Paul and the original disciples from Jesus all of those years ago. You're here this morning following Jesus because of a chain of effective handoffs that eventually led to you. So effective handoffs are pretty important, which brings us to the question then, how do we do it? But before we get into the more concrete elements of an effective handoff, I want to stop for a minute because I think there's one important point that we all need to understand in order to do this well as a community. Because you could very easily, at this moment, some of us, be tempted to just kind of tune out a little bit. Because you can think like, all right, this is a message for parents. This is like, we're talking about, parents of younger kids, parents of teenagers. This doesn't really apply to me at my stage of life. Maybe you're here this morning and you don't have kids yet. Or maybe you're here this morning and your kids have already grown and they're out of the house and you feel like, I've done my handoff already. I've done it. Or maybe you're feeling your kids are maybe too young or too worried, or too young to really be all that worried about this morning. Or maybe you're here this morning and you're like, I am a kid. Like, I'm a kid or I'm a teenager. Like, this isn't really for me. Well, let me tell you, and I hope that we can have an understanding of this, the reality is that we are all responsible for effective handoffs of the faith. Passing the baton is not just the work of individuals or couples who have kids living with them, or pastors or youth leaders. It's the work of the community. Whichever of these categories that I mentioned previously that you might fall into, whether you have no kids or you have grown kids or you're a kid, that doesn't mean that there are not people younger in age or younger in the faith than you that you can invest in and be a part of the handoff of faith to them. Paul is writing to Timothy. Timothy is not Paul's child. Timothy is passing this on to reliable people. They are not Timothy's children. This is a community responsibility. We are all called to do this. Not just parents, not just youth leaders, not just pastors, the community. So hopefully now that we understand that, we can start looking at the question of how do we do this well? And the first part of doing it as well is just understanding it's all of our responsibility. But to help us understand this a little bit more, in addition to Scripture, we're going to turn to another book that I'm sure most of you have right there, like on your bedside table. You're probably very familiar with it. That's right, I'm talking about the U.S. Track and Field Rule Book. Things I'm going to be telling you already know, I'm sure. We're going to look at rule number 25, very familiar. The baton shall be a smooth, hollow, circular tube made of wood, metal, or other rigid material in one piece. Its length shall be between 28 and 30 centimeters. Its circumference shall be between 12 and 13 centimeters. It shall weigh not less than 50 grams. No material or substance may be applied to the baton. Again, telling you things you already know. I know. This is it. This is what the baton looks like. Smooth cylinder. It's very light. It's a lot lighter than I expected it to be, which I guess makes sense because you're running with it. You don't want like a 20-pound baton if you're running along with it. But here's the thing. The second requirement of passing the baton well is it has to be the right baton. It has to be the baton that is described in the rule books. A couple months back, we had an event, a youth group that we called Neon Night. It's a picture of our students in our Neon Night there. As part of this event, we played a lot of glow-in-the-dark games. It was a lot of fun. But one of the games we played was a game called Anything But a Putter Mini Golf. And we had all throughout the church here, like there were all these bulbs. You see where there were black lights in all the bulbs and everything. This place looked very different. And we had a mini golf course set up all throughout the church. And the students had to play through the course. And as you can probably guess, what they had to do, they had to play through the course with anything but a putter. You could not use a putter. So they had these or light-colored golf balls. And they had to play through the course. Here's some pictures of some of the things that our students use. We got Dave Christensen there playing with a mop, and Will with his plunger, and Jackson there with a shovel. We had a lot. The level of creativity of our students was pretty amazing. We had students with a ukulele. We had somebody bring a banana. Caleb, he's right there. It was crazy the amount of stuff that they brought to play mini golf. But here's the thing, obviously, you're not going to walk out on a real golf course with a mop and be like, I'm ready to go, I'm ready to play. If you're playing an actual sport, there's certain criteria that equipment has to meet in order to be allowed on the course. And in a relay race, there is certain criteria that a baton has to meet in order to be allowed to be used as a baton in a relay race. You're not running down there passing traffic cones to each other, things like that. It has to be the right baton. This is true of our spiritual relay race as well. We're called to pass a very specific baton. What's the right baton? Well, I think Paul describes it in the first part of verse 2 where he says to pass on the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses. Paul is saying, pass on the gospel of Jesus, that we need to know him and his salvation purchased through us through his death, burial, and resurrection, and follow him in obedience to the teaching of his word. This is the baton that we are called to be passing on. But here's a thought that I found throughout my life as a somewhat anxiety-inducing thought, that we might not always be 100% conscious of what batons we are passing on to the next generation of believers. Several years ago at Grace, we held a parenting class here at Grace based on a curriculum by Les and Leslie Parrott called Parenting the Early Years. And a story that Les Parrott, who's a Christian counselor, told in this series has always stuck with me. He talked about a conversation that he had with his young son, and they were talking, as parents and children often do, about what his son wanted to do and what his son wanted to be when he grew up. And his son responded to him, and he said something that kids will often say in these types of conversations. Dad, I want to be like you. And now most people, we would hear that and think, oh, that's so nice, that's so sweet, that's so cute, it's adorable. Les talked about feeling kind of nervous and anxious as he heard his son say that, because he said that he began to ask himself, if my son wants to be like me, am I a person that I want my son to be like? Which led to the whole core premise of that study, which was our kids and the younger people around us learn more about life and faith from who we are than what we say. And that's not to say that what we say is not important and we don't need to be speaking and teaching truths of our faith to our younger generation, but what is more important is whether we are modeling the life that we want to pass on to our kids and to those younger in the faith than us. What batons are we passing on? Am I passing on a life of faith and trust in Jesus? Or am I passing on the baton of a life built on a fearful desire to control and direct my own life at all costs? Am I passing on generosity? Or am I passing on selfishness? Am I passing on judgment and anger and bitterness? Or am I passing on forgiveness and grace? Are we intentional about passing on the right baton so that we can say to those younger in the faith the same words that Paul spoke in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where he said these words, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ"? Are we intentional about passing on the right baton? The next thing we need to know to have an effective handoff is that we have limited space for a handoff. Again, let's go back to the track and field rule book. I'm sure most of you have this memorized. Or rule number 2, each takeover zone shall be 20 meters long, of which the scratch line is the center. The zones shall start and finish at the edges of the zone lines nearest the start line in the running direction. I mean, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Now, I don't know what a scratch line is, or really most of those words, but the one thing that I can draw out of this rule is that there is a defined space that the baton handover has to take place within. And it can't happen outside of that area. And the reality is we have a limited amount of time to pass the baton as well. A little while back, I remember reading about this practice of one set of parents. They used to have a tangible reminder in their house when their kids were born, just a reminder of the finite amount of time that they had with their kids living with them in their home in the majority for the majority of their time. And what they did was they used a jar of marbles, like this one here. If a child becomes a part of our community, our church community, beginning at birth, between birth and the time they graduate high school, we would have roughly 950 weeks with that child, beginning from birth to that child would graduate high school. These parents would have 950 marbles in a jar. And each week, they would take at the end of the week, they would take a marble out of the jar and drop it in another jar. And they would reflect on that past week. What had they done? What had they taught? What had they modeled in that last week to pass on the important things that they wanted to pass on, the important elements of faith? And I'd wish I'd read about this practice much earlier in our lives as parents, because I do think it can be a very effective, tangible reminder of the need to be intentional as parents. But it's also a reminder of our need to be intentional as a community with our time with the people around us that are younger than us in our faiths. Because eventually, we come to the point, really where Kel and I are right now, where this is what's left. One more week. I wasn't sure I was going to make it through this part. Until Anna graduates high school. Eventually, we come to the point where there's one marble left, and then that's gone. The people whose lives you have the opportunity to influence are not always going to be in that position to receive your influence to the degree that they are right now. We need to recognize that time is finite and be intentional about using it while we have it. But this might be bringing up this morning, maybe a question for some that might be feeling this morning, like, what if I've dropped the baton? What if I've botched this handoff? What then? And I can understand that can certainly be that could be associated with difficult feelings and pain. But I think we can also take comfort in the reality that a dropped baton can still be picked up. Enough seriousness, we need to go back to the rule book. Rule number 12. The baton shall be carried by hand throughout the race. If dropped, it shall be recovered by the athlete who dropped it. He or she may leave the assigned lane to retrieve the baton, provided no other runner is impeded, and provided that by doing so, the distance to be covered is not lessened. If we're looking back on our efforts to pass the baton this morning and feeling like they weren't where they should be, the reality is we can still pick it up. We can still pick it up and begin to work on an effective handoff now. But the problem is, when batons drop, we tend to do other things instead of working to pick up the baton. I played a lot of sports growing up, and in a lot of my teams growing up, my dad was my coach. And I remember something he used to say to me all the time. Anytime I would make a mistake, anytime I would mess something up in a game, he would say, Eric, there are going to be times in games when things do not go your way. You're going to make a mistake. There's going to be an error. What you can't do in those moments is, he would say, you can't take what he would call a personal timeout. A personal timeout is like when you make a mistake in a game, like if I were playing baseball and I go to field the ball and I drop it, instead of picking up the ball, I kick the dirt and I throw my hands up in the air, or I get angry at somebody else that made a mistake. But you know what's happening while I'm doing that is the game is still going on. Runners are still circling the bases. Things are still happening. He said you can't take a personal timeout. You need to pick up the ball and keep on playing. Keep going after the ball. We can't stop. We can't sulk. We can't throw our hands up in the air. We need to keep going. And you'll see this happen all the time in sports. When mistakes get made, people take their own little personal timeouts, and the game continues on. You'll see this in these race videos that I watch, where batons drop, and instead of picking up the baton, the two racers stop and just look angrily at each other and accusing each other. And when they could pick up the baton and keep on running. We so often do other things other than picking up the baton. We mourn the dropped baton. We complain about the dropped baton. We debate whose fault it is that the baton dropped. And these things, though, aren't valuable and they're not helpful. Instead, let's pick up the baton and keep trying to pass it. Even if maybe you're not in a position to pick up your own baton, but you might find yourself in a position to help somebody else pick up their baton. And somebody else might find themselves in a position to help pick up the baton that was dropped by you. That's why we are formed into this community of believers here in the church. But the main thing is, we don't want to waste time lamenting that we pick up the baton that is within our reach and we work to pass it. One last thing I think is helpful for us to understand when it comes to effective handoffs is, perhaps you're here and you're listening to this and you're thinking, Eric, I worked really hard to pass the baton well, and it still dropped. And I know that's a reality for people. And all I can say is that just like in a relay race, You can have the best baton pass in the world, and the new runner still has to run their race. The new runner still has to continue on. There's a reality that's crucial for us to understand, is that we can pass the baton in a way that sets up a new runner for the best possible chance to run well. But whether or not they do, once that baton leaves our hands, it's out of our control what happens with it then. But here's the good news. No matter where you are in your past efforts to pass the baton or where you are now, what's true for all of us is that we can start now. We can start now. You can decide today to be intentional about being a part of passing the baton of faith on to those who are younger in the faith. A few very practical ways that we can do this. Pray. Pray for our kids. Pray for our students. Pray for those around you that you know are younger in the faith than you. Pray that God will be at work in their lives. Pray for these graduates that we're going to be bringing up here. Pray for the graduates that have come before that are currently still in college. Pray that God would bring and surround them with the people that they need, the communities that they need to know Jesus, to grow in their understanding of faith, and that God would be at work in their hearts and lives. Pray. Find ways to let kids and students know they are welcome. You know, if you're here about 15, 20 minutes before the service, there's a lot of sprinting going on. And you know, we can respond in a couple ways. We can be annoyed. We can be like, slow down. Or we could be angry, or we can be celebratory. We can be thrilled that these kids are in church, are here, are a part of our community. Find ways to encourage kids and students in the ways you see them following Jesus. Can I tell you one of our favorite moments in our household? It's when we go get the mail and we find that there's a letter from Stan Hagberg. I'm sure many of us have been recipients of Stan's letters. Stan, what I appreciate about Stan, among the many things, is he never misses an opportunity to express to those younger in the faith how much he appreciates them when he sees them serving and using their gifts for Jesus. Stan is someone who invests in passing the baton of faith to those in the next generation of believers. And I've been so thankful that my kids have grown up in a community like Grace, where there have been so many adults and people mature in the faith that have sought to invest in them. And as we celebrate our students leading us in worship this morning, and some of our students moving on to the next chapter of their lives after high school, my prayer is that we will not only continue to be a community that invests in passing the baton of faith to the next generation, but that through the work of the Holy Spirit that we will continue to grow in our capacity to do this and pass the baton of faith well.